In this episode of Anticlockwise, I'm thrilled to have Dr. Atreyee Majumder with me, who is an anthropologist, poet, and associate professor at the National Law School of India, University, Bangalore. Her work constellates seemingly disparate worlds brilliantly with a PhD from Yale. Her first book, Time, Space, and Capital in India, develops the idea of hinterland urbanism, spaces shaped by industrial capital, yet lying outside its centers. Today, we are going to dive into that work as well as her fascinating current research, which looks at how the Vaishnavite devotional tradition of bhakti survives and even flourishes against the velocity of contemporary urban life in Vrindavan as remainders and fragments. So, with that, let's go to Atri. Thank you so much, Atrey, for coming to Anticlockwise. And I'm really excited to talk about ruins and Bhakti and Brindavan and all those exciting stuff. So,
Thank you.
first,
I'm delighted to speak to you.
thank you so much. So, my first question is, could you talk a little bit about the evolution of your research? How you came from, the discussion of urban industrial hinterlands of Calcutta to the ruins of Brindavan. I can see some thorough lines with time and capital, but could you elucidate a little bit more?
Sure. It is actually a rather strange story. My undergraduate degree is in law, and I went to graduate school to the anthropology department at Yale University with a project that was surrounding questions of land acquisition, law, and political economy. And that led me over the 2 years of coursework questions of the Marxist study of space. And I
Mhm,
became increasingly in Bengal, as you know, those were the days, the years right after the Nondigram Shingur incidents.
mhm,
And I became very, very interested in the industrial spaces that already existed in Bengal, which were outside of this neoliberal industrial drive,
mhm,
which were
mhm,
not the kind of SEZ style industrial drives, but the older rounds of industrialization that Bengal had experienced, which took me to many places in Bengal outside of Calcutta, and finally to the industrial district of Howrah, which led to my doctoral dissertation and my first book, Time, Space, and Capital in India, which was a book that was generated out of my graduate training in political economy, in studies, urban anthropology, and the anthropology of edges of metropolitan cities. So I wasn't so interested in big cities. I was interested in cities that called themselves urban but were practically somehow putting their urbanism together. It was a kind of ramshackle urbanism, so to speak. And I call those spaces hinterlands or urban industrial hinterlands. But I went to the field in 2010 and 11 with these questions. When I came back to the graduates department in New Haven, uh, bathed in questions of time and questions of placemaking and questions of storytelling and how narrative holds temporal charge or currency. Um, I had read some Benjamin on thesis on philosophy of history and critique of violence and little bits here and there from the arcades. But I started studying Benjamin more carefully and later Heidegger on being and time. And it occurred to me as I absorbed my fieldwork material that there was a fundamental question here about how people inhabit, immerse in, absorb, and narrate time. So the questions of gentrification, the questions of, the Neil Smith, David Harvey school of questions, which I was very loyal to, I became less and less loyal to. Not that those questions are not important, but they were less and less of interest to me. And I became fascinated with the question of time passing, dropping kind of like wax melting, dropping kind of residues on the spatial fiber of a region or a nation or a city or a district. So I started seeing time in a Benjaminian way, which is essentially that the world is spatialized time,
Mhm.
and space is essentially coagulated time, um, which is a thought and a fascination, and if you might call it an obsession, which has remained with me in the years that followed. For personal reasons, I showed up for a as a devotee in Vrindavan in 2019. And at this time, I'm kind of religio-curious. I know nothing about religion. I've never read a theological text. I come from political economy and Marxist studies, and some maybe maybe at the most I'll go to some kind of critiques of religion or commentaries of religion on the Frankfurt School side, including Benjamin, but nothing else. And I have no idea about the Indic religious traditions at this time. 2019 was a turning point, not only for me as a religio-curious or a devotee kind of person, but it was the beginnings of what I saw to be a longer engagement, like perhaps lifelong engagement with religion, theology, questions of the divine, and the question of the devotional soul. Not that these things came to me as a readily kind of ready package of a research project, but I saw in that first trip, which was February 9th, 2019, which is when the Pulwama attack happened
Mhm.
in the Kashmir borders, and on that day I was in Vrindavan, and the mixed signals, the contradictory messages of the Indian religious public sphere kind of were making a cacophonous noise in my ears, and I couldn't not pay attention to it. Over time, that has become. I've just completed about 10 months of long-term fieldwork over the years 2024 and 2025 in the Braj region of Vrindavan, and now I'm beginning to write a non-fiction style book, which I hope will also absorb my academic and theological questions and anthropological questions about the nature of interiority, the nature of the soul, and why devotion subsists in the extremely market-oriented religious public sphere, where everything sells. The divine signature stamp sells, um, kitsch sells, architecture of heritage and ancient sacralization sells in the marketplace. Everything sells. Why does some kind of authentic, sacred sense of devotion survive? It should, ideally, practically, I would have said it would have died a predictable death by now, but it hasn't. And that contradiction is where I'm at currently. And this project is also quite immersed increasingly in the sonic atmosphere of devotion, where in Vrindavan, I noticed for the first time, as I started going there repeatedly, that everyone sings and everyone plays the kortal or the cymbals or the mridangam or the pakawaj or the tanpura, sometimes the rudravina, and there are people who sing badly, there's people who sing okay, and there are people who sing absolutely in the sublimest of ways, but there's music everywhere. So that sonic sensorium is something that I cannot not absorb and immerse in and pay attention to, not only for pleasure but also for as a mode of contemplation of what it means to be a devotee. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and that can lead into several questions. And it kind of, I was really struck by the way you talk about, you use that wax metaphor, which is really interesting because their ruin is also very physical. It's not just, ruin as an idea or ruin as something which is like a patina left from the past, but something which is becoming ruin or in the state of ruination, as and Laura Stoller would say. But it is also very reminiscent of. This is something that I'm mentioning because I was just reading a book on perception that compares the writing of Merleau-Ponty and the Protovigga school of Indic thought, where there is an
Who is this? Who is this
uh,
that you were reading?
the book is, I'm forgetting. I can email you the name of the author, but it's basically compares the philosophy of Merleau-Ponty with Utpal Deva, who is a part of the Protovigga Kashmiri Sufism school. And it's interesting that in that school, the mirror is something which is also very physical. So the metaphor they use is that of water, and then water can turn into ice, or water can kind of liquefy into water, or it can have a reflection of itself. So like the ruin and the sacred are not physically separable. That's a sense that I also got from your commentary, that it's not a clear division between, oh, there is Krishna in his, kind of a textual or devotional or emotional life, and then there is the city of Vrindavan, which is for all practical means and purposes a North Indian city with everything that we know about usual North Indian cities. But these two are constantly kind of interacting, the ruin and the sacred, the bazaar and the kind of maybe the metaphor of the bazaar in Vaishnavite songs, all of those are constantly interacting. So that leads me to my second question. I'm very tempted to go into the musical question, but I will stick to the kind of more devotee question. You call yourself a devotee monster in this really fascinating web repository website you have called Constellations, which presents this archive, or I thought it's kind of an anti-archive of your fieldwork in Vrindavan. And you have all these different, snapshots of Vrindavan life, which seem to me that it bring together a lot of different aspects of the self. So the one that kind of easily struck someone is the wanderer self. You are just kind of walking through streets and you are getting a glimpse into the life of Vrindavan, and you are kind of capturing them. But there is also your anthropologist self. You are doing fieldwork there, and you have your devotee self there too, because you mentioned you found yourself as a devotee first there, and then you kind of Vrindavan became the subject of your anthropological study. But in any case, so how do all these different selves interact? How do they come together or they constellate in Vrindavan?
That's a very generous and difficult question, but let me try to do it some justice. Constellations is a word I'm very fond of, borrowing also from Benjamin, where he says that the components of a constellation are total in themselves. Each component is a totality, complete in itself, and yet the constellation lends to each member part a fragmentation or an incompletion which is completed when they're seen in a constellating arrangement. And that is how I see myself. I think I see my writerly self and my anthropological self and my devotee self and my whatever kind of opportunist academic entrepreneurialism self, all of that together, as a kind of constellating arrangement, without which each of those parts are incomplete, or a fragment of a total arrangement,
Mhm.
and they cannot be seen. They change shape and dimension when they're seen in that arrangement aesthetic. So this web repository is basically a labor of love that emerged out of the work that I did over the last 10 months in Vrindavan, supported by the Wenegren post PhD grant. And it is a public and private record of exposing and immersing myself in a Krishna immersed or Krishna shaped world. Um, in so in making this, um, I laid myself bare as a moving sense registration system. So instead of a self, which has a far more kind of politically hoity toity um, repercussion, let me use the term not even self, not subject, not agent, but a sense registration system, which is the kind of way often Mahayana Buddhists look at the self, that it is minimally present to register the world through the sensory devices. Through these sensory devices that I have at my disposal, including the sense of intuition, I deploy them in the world so as to dilute any possible boundary between the inward and the outward, the inside and the outside. Someone asked me, I was a jury member at an ethnographic poetry competition, and for that we did a some kind of uh, Q&A or something like that. And someone asked me, what is an anthropological object? And I said, I don't see the objects in my kitchen or of the objects in my heart and the objects in Vrindavan as necessarily typologically distinct. That categorization or classificatory paradigm in which the social sciences and sometimes the humanities are forced to operate, the Constellations web project and my own kind of creative work and my social science work, to an extent, are constantly trying to push back against. I don't believe in classificatory paradigms. I don't believe in a necessary categorical divide between ruptures and continuities. And thereby, I think my work in the creative or in the anthropological or in the religious, curious register, they refuse the definitions that are offered by the contemporaneous moment. And in so doing, this collection is pivoted on refusal a refusal to be defined by any kind of contemporary or here and now consensus. And you're very right to call it an anti-archive. I also see this whole situation as an anti-context. I'm constantly, I know you read my Substack, and I rant about it there too, and in some of my other writing, that I'm constantly frustrated and trying to push back against the aboutness of things. And social science of the current register of the current um, moment and domain forces us to first ask, what is this about? Is it about religion? Is it about labor? Is it about capital? Is it about South Asia? Is it about the soul? How can all of these things be connected? And like I said, this inward and outward and this refusal of aboutness are stemming from, originating from the same place of discomfort, where things originate not in categories. We put them, create categories and put them there. And then we only way we can liberate ourselves from categories is by asking what other categories we can make, which is where the politics of difference is gone in today's world. I'm sorry, I'm digressing, but I'll come back in just a moment. The politics of difference is constantly creating new categories, but it doesn't attack the category of the category.
Mhm.
And I guess these multiple sense registration systems then organize themselves as a kind of constellation of pointless fragments that make meaning in the most magical and serendipitous of ways. Um, if I may be more candid with you, the search for God and my struggles with mental illness have been closely intertwined in my own journey. I wouldn't have become a poet. I often say this in poetry festivals. I wouldn't have become a poet had I not gone mad. And there came a point where I had hallucinations about angels and demons, the Hindu god Krishna, various wars, ghosts of bygone eras, indeterminate histories, and so on and so forth. And these experiences over a decade led me to write about 37 poems, which became my first book of poems, which is called The Book of Blue. It came out in 2024. And this book is divided into three sections called Time, Restless, and Still, which not linearly, but somehow organize themselves into three sections of my biographical journey. And going forward in that kind of creative and also academic journey, I find that I have to now I've delved into biography enough, and now I have to wrap up the biographical part to immerse more deeply into the cosmological questions, the theologically relevant questions. Some of my new poems are about kind of time travel, switching um, of registers of millennia to years to weeks to days, about myths, about the presence of other past lives or other lives in one's own singular individual earthly life, and so on and so forth. Um, the allusion you make to the walking self is central. That's methodologically central to how all of this happens. I won't say it happens in a neat, organized kind of way. It cannot, and I'd rather it did not. But that moving through the world as a with live sensory devices and constantly being aware of the sense registration and using writing as a modality that constantly records the sense registration is the way I live and I do field work. Yeah,
Hmm.
I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
No, that's really amazing, and thanks for sharing your creative and personal journey. Um, and it really fascinates me how you talk about yourself as a kind of perceptual recorder or perceptual witness, one could say even. So that also reminded me of a lecture Arindam Chakraborty had, where he talks about how the original meaning of daiva in Indic thought is related to, like, the daiva makes appearance through the perception. So even before it's textual or anything else, it has to be perceptual. So that and again, the point that you raised about the limitations of current academic kind of understanding about putting the context first, or sometimes what I have also kind of personally experienced with my own work, that okay, keep this about only one point, just talk about either soul or perception or time or something like that. So yeah, I was just saying that the point that you raise about academics having to put kind of arguments into these small pigeonholes, and into the kind of putting context first, which I think has come with a lot of North American kind of style of academic writing too, that you'll have to kind of everything has to be foregrounded. So that's something that I have experienced too. But in any case, the way you talk about kind of protest against context or typologies, taxonomies, etc., so on, that is really methodologically fascinating. So could you talk about how, specifically for anthropology and generally for social science and humanities, how your approach kind of pushes back against the ideas we have of the participant observer, or autoethnographer, or someone who does, you know, some ethnographer, etc. So all these different personas have different roles, and how your work is kind of disrupting those roles to an extent, if I'm understanding it correct.
Especially in the Vrindavan work, not so much in my earlier Bengal work. In Vrindavan, I realized quite quickly that if I hold a mic to a person's face and who hasn't eaten in the last 24 hours and asked him or her about their devotional soul, it would be a joke. Not just because I would be being cruel, I would be being foolish. So I learned very quickly in the while doing this field work that the traditional interview format of talking to expect the a certain kind of narrative device of the interview to reveal the truths of a person's life as at least as they see them was not going to work. And so I started building a set of bodily and perceptual practices to complement the talking. And increasingly towards the end, the talking took a backseat. I started going and talking to important people, in the structured interview format, and that helped. And it taught me a lot about, especially about, kind of politics in Vrindavan, environmental challenges in Vrindavan, about theological debates among the Gaudiya Vaishnavas or even the Ramanuja sect, etc. Um, but my questions were not being answered directly or even indirectly by the kind of enactment of a interview civility, let me call it that. It's a certain kind of interview bhadrata. And I started refusing it. My consciousness started refusing it after a while, saying, this will not do. I'm cheating myself. I'm deceiving myself. I'm pretending that this is what ethnography consists of, and I must do it in order to um, satisfy someone, least of all myself, that this is the way it is done. And so, walking, absorbing sounds and sights, photographs, videos, um, sitting for ages on end in temple courtyards, sometimes listening to music, sometimes just overhearing people talk, sometimes watching the temple rituals at the ghats, watching the arati on the Yamuna, etc., became a kind of bodily repertoire that I repeated day on day, month on month. And I think some conservatives might say that that is not good enough, or and some, the sensory ethnography is a kind of thriving field in some quarters of the discipline. They might say this is correct or whatever, in somewhere oscillating between a kind of traditional ethnographic modality and the sensory ethnographic mandates. I was swinging, and in this swing I it was filled with fear, anxiety, joy, enlightenment, wonder, awe, all kinds of things. And I started learning over time to treat the language speaking entity and the non language speaking entity or subjects as equal. That the river and the built environment and the temple courtyard and the shadows were as important to me, and the music and the sound and were as important to me as someone giving me a potted history of this or that temple. Um, and so uh, a phenomenological immersion without my actually consciously starting to do it somewhere started emerging and started spreading throughout my practice. I started taking my own emotional register and spectrum very seriously. I started writing in all kinds of forms, whatever I could find to be speaking to that emotion and that moment. It didn't matter whether it was an ethnographic article or a book chapter or this or that. I would write, refusing sometimes the possibility of academic acceptance or even the possibility, absolute possibility of refusal of academic acceptance. I started writing in the modalities or in the formats which spoke to my state of being at that time. Sometimes it was a poem, sometimes it was a blog post, sometimes it was an aphorism, a fragment. And in these kinds of disorganized or indisciplined forms or unruly forms, I started absorbing the sensorium of Vrindavan. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a version of it that I'm very influenced by Zhao Biel's work. It's a book called Vita, where he spends maybe about a decade in an abandonment facility, abandonment care facility in on the edges of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and he becomes friends with a particular person, a woman who lives there and who has been kind of, shunned from society. Family has left them there, and they are mentally somewhat unstable, but somewhat also extremely erudite and speaks the truths of their existence in an extremely striking way. And their friendship and their conversations carry on for over a decade, and that leads to a certain kind of poignancy to the ethnographic work. um, and in those inspirations, I think I carry on with anthropology despite my various kind of complaints about the regular registers of how things should be done or how things are anthropologically acceptable.
Yeah, I really have a lot of admiration for anthropologists. I got to have many anthropologist friends through the American Institute of India Studies Junior Fellowship, which I also had. So people just spend months in islands, uh, in the Brahmaputras, or like all these kinds of things, while we just read some texts and go to National Archive and National Library. Uh, but in any case, the point you
Different
made,
kinds of immersions. They're immersions regardless. Everyone is
yeah,
immersing,
true,
right?
true. Yeah, yeah. I had this conversation with Shundib about it, and he said that these are different from forms of close reading, which is something that
Mm,
was really, I think, an insightful answer. But the way you talk about time as a kind of witnessing that you are immersing yourself in the rhythm of life in Vrindavan, sometimes in temple rituals. Of course, you have a different kind of timeline, which is that of deadlines and meeting the grant kind of parameters. So you have a kind of amount of time in the field work, but time is also an object that you study in your previous work, where it's tied to the capital. So, and then of course, you were also talking about not being bogged down by the contemporary, which is something that we hope to do in this podcast as a whole. As Anticlockwise, we have recently started a series on the idea of slowness in philosophy and art.
mm, mm.
So, how does time kind of figure in your work, or different modes of time kind of shape the way you do your field work or witness Brindavan in different ways?
Right. Um, so broadly, there are three moments in my journey with time. And the first moment is when I found in a small village in possibly northern Howrah, a young woman who told me that she goes round and round the village, the borders of the village, to find a sense of expanse. And that to me was the first entry point into um, the scalar expanse or scalar play argument that I deploy in my book with regard to time, temporal scale, that from the limits of um, that boundary, the geographical boundary of the village, by the walking rhythm, the temporal rhythm of the round and round walking, she is able to expand the sensation um, she's able to expand the sensation of the geographical um, scale, so to speak. So there's a scalar expanse. What I'm trying to say is that there's a scalar expanse which is enabled by that rhythm of the walking. And that was the first time it was a breakthrough for me. It was a normal conversation where it like pretty much changed my life. And I went first to recur, and later to Heidegger. And by that time, I'd moved away from the time and history argument.
Mhm.
So although the arguments about endogenous historicities of the non-West, the history one, history two argument of Chakrabarti and others, um, have impacted me, but had left me by then because I was more interested in this wax melting phenomenon. So finally, I landed on Benjamin and the kind of coagulation of time through the built environment kind of question. Um, and I write somewhere about actually possibly on the Substack about the Sham Benegal 1985 film Trikal, which is about time because Trikal is like three layers of time, and then this film is at the brink of time where Goa is supposed to be annexed by the newly independent India, and Goa is still not part of India. It's in the early 1950s in Goa by featuring a Portuguese family, and also there is a candlelit ghostly house, and this mansion which is candlelit everywhere is these candle flames are are flickering in this kind of fragile way, and dropping wax, kind of molten wax. It becomes the metaphor for times like fragile yet constant generation of residue. So the residual or the remainder is how I see the world at large. And this I get from Benjamin, even if I sometimes kind of press forth with Benjamin a little bit too much to the exclusion of others, um, that there is a certain sense of um, everything in the world is that is a version of that molten wax.
Mhm.
Space is coagulated time, the world as a remainder. And that thought has then led to into the Vrindavan project, where now I think of time as the ultimate mysterium that increasingly interested to see what physicists have been saying about time, Feynman, etc. That it's an illusion and it doesn't predate the universe.
Mhm.
It's when things start happening, the eventality of the universe or the eventality of worlds um, is what leads to the perception and sensation of time. Um, and as much as I listen to them, I don't entirely agree with that philosophical position. But although I find it fascinating, for me, um, the passing and the not passing things happen, and they happen from one thing to another to another to another, and they don't often pass from one to the next to the next to the next. And this uh, continuity that is embedded within the membranes of rupture is where time lies. I will provisionally say that that's where my guess or my fascination is currently at, and I'll call it the ultimate mysterium, which is where the divine kind of glory or mystery or mystique lies there. But I'm very clear that the questions that surround time are different and distinct from the questions that surround history or historicity.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I really like that point that you make, that the time is not always history, because it's not exactly like, there is the history and then there is more culturally specific history, history one, history two. You are making kind of, I think, a very distinct argument there, that um, there are times which are not necessarily part of the seriality or the kind of
Yeah, the
narrative. Yeah,
seriality and the additive,
yeah, right.
one adds on to the other, adds on to the other, the additive logic, like almost like a cash register.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and it definitely reminds me of how Kali is imagined as someone as who kind of disrupts the kal as the continuity of time. It is more like a kairotic specific kind of time which is outside the bound of a regular time. But I'm
Yes.
now excited to get into the most interesting portion of this interview perhaps, which is about music, because that's something that really resonated with me. And you have a series of fascinating essays on music. Either those are on music or music is at the backdrop of it, so you are listening to Bach, or there is some kind of a reference to music as a backdrop of your thought, or as something that you are actively kind of thinking and feeling about. And this leads to the question of style and musical ethos, which I have studied at RK and Narendrapur, and I have been immersed to these kinds of different musical forms, or those are not necessarily strictly kind of rags. Okay, Malkos is about Shiva, or Behag is about Krishna, not even strictly that, but the same hymn or the same music can take a different kind of character depending on the specific deity who is being invoked. So, could you talk in general about how you witnessed music in Vrindavan, and you also play violin? So, how is there kind of even a musician's self which is active in your constellations?
I hope to God there is a musician self. So sound is my most recent and strongest fascination currently. And I find that the more I struggle to write sound, the more I try to write sound. And of course, I fail. And then I write again, and then I write again. That's why there's so many Substack newsletters which have something or the other to do indirectly or directly with music. Um, I'm particularly fascinated with, I know the basics of the internality of Hindustani music very, very basically. I am not trained, but in the violin and in the Western classical music, I am somewhat trained. And these two traditions are very, very different, but they fascinate me um, in the way that um, I think unless it's not something, let me put it this way, sorry. Um, it is not something one can textualize easily. To textualize Bach would be to like put literally the sheet music um, up on print or in a book and say this is Bach. This is not Bach. You have to listen to Bach. I'm particularly fond of 1060 in his archive, which is oboe and violin concerto, which I play over and over again in my headphones. Um, and the sheet music is only an entry point, or the notes, or in the Hindustani case, the rag or the tal, or the lay or the whatever else, even the bhava are entry points into a world which refuses incarceration by language, which is possibly my most point of my greatest fascination. That how um, no matter how well you have trained yourself, you've listened to it over and over again, you know the sheet music, you know what rag it is, you know what scale it is, that what minor it is, what major it is, in um, you can't describe it. It's very hard to describe in the textual language in which we traverse. Often people will say in Vrindavan that there are all kinds of sectarian arguments about music, which is rather sad. But people have started saying these kinds of things, that the Hindu side of music is more on the Drupad side, and the Islamic it is Khayal. And I don't see historical evidence pointing to these kinds of conclusions. Sometimes they will say the Darbari and Miyaki Malhar will not be sung in the temples because they are sung for the emperor, the Mughal emperor. Uh, but what I did find fascinating is during these communal singing or Samaj Gayan, what they call Samaj Gayan or communal singing exercises in the temples, the lead singer would introduce improvisations which no one had been warned about. There was no sheet music there. Like, and when an orchestra plays, there is sheet music, and you follow it and you follow the conductor. But here, there's no conductor, there's no sheet music, there's improvisations that they're putting in at their own whim, and everyone else kind of falls in line.
Hmm.
Everyone else is able to intuit what the lead singer is doing, and they follow through. And I started singing with them a couple of times, and then I found ke मुझसे तो नहीं हो पाएगा, which means that uh, it this is beyond me. That this intuition for the musical improvisation and play, and each line is repeating, but sometimes it's repeating, like the first three
Hmm.
sections of the line will repeat two times, and sometimes the next time around it'll repeat three times, and the next time around it'll repeat only once. And this is how the play is organized, and none of it is written anywhere. So I asked them, some of these theologians and priests who are also musicians. You'll find two of these interviews on the Constellations website. And I asked them, how do you do it? And they say, like, these are people who've sung with each other for many, many years. They know how things operate, and they're able to create a certain kind of technique. I guess the word that might come closest to this kind of intuition for musical play or improvisation is technique. But what kind of technique is, I guess, anything which is practically contingent upon the play with time and space, one can't convert to language. I guess that's my kind of most important takeaway from this training in sound, is that you can't, if you ride a bicycle, you can't really create a user manual for someone else to ride a bicycle. That other person also has to ride the bicycle. Or you can't swim, or I don't know, a mountaineer, and create a complete user manual which someone will read and start mountaineering right there. That other person also has to learn mountaineering or swimming or riding a bicycle. Similarly with sound, um there's I tried singing and I sing all right, but um that embedded intuition is is far from where an outsider anthropologist or just a curious person who just goes and sits with the gang can even hope to be even partially embedded in. And so much of Shandip and I could talk about this quite a lot. So much of what people get out of music is the beauty of, Surdasa's poetry or Kabir's poetry, or whatever else, the language of music, the language of songs. But for me, songs come later. Um, Music is its own language, and it's superimposed with the songs that come from textual language. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much it.
Yeah, the thing that you called it techne, but probably my romanticist self thought about the idea of attunement. So you are kind of, there are moments when your inner rhythms, in a very Wordsworthian sense, is just attuned to the nature of things and the music in this sense. So that was really fascinating. Could you now, this is my last question, talk about the future of public scholarship or public humanities because you do that in different forms with Constellations, your podcast, your newsletter, certainly. So how, and I hear the phrase public humanities a lot now in the US academy. It's a new buzzword or new cultural capital or academic capital, but there is, I feel, a real need to kind of intuit about knowledge or about think about sharing knowledge which do not necessarily follow the logic of context or the logic of other kinds of shared academic personas. So where do you see the future and present of public humanities?
I think that there's nothing that we know as scholars of social sciences or humanities that we cannot express to a reasonably patient and open minded individual. That individual can be aged anywhere above 14. 14 and above, anybody who is reasonably patient shares, of course, a language with you. They have to either know English or Bangla or French or whatever, the language in which you're expressing yourself. They have to understand that language. If they are, if there's a common language and they're somewhat open and they're patient, anything that we know, nothing that we know is so difficult that it can only be written in garbled language for um, paywall journals. So that's my first point about the need for publicness of the scholar. Public humanities as a North American preoccupation, I'm amused. I'll stop there about that. Um, post the the post university learning paradigm is coming. It's already here with the Coursera, Domestika, various AI-driven learning portals, and the opening up of TED Talks and those kinds of things, those kinds of spaces. Post-university imagination of learning is already here. Academics and scholars who operated so far within the four walls of protected environments of universities are being slow and somewhat horse blinkered in not acknowledging what is already here. This moment of the demand for public scholarship is here. Scholars have no choice, will have no choice in the next 10 or 20 years to it's not a fashionable thing anymore. They have to engage with the public, because I feel in the next 10 or 20 years universities will play less of a role in the ecosystem of learning, and these other spaces will come up in a more robust way, and we have no choice but to engage with them. And as an ethic of learning, I feel anything I say for a salary inside my classroom, I should be able to say a simpler and more accessible version of it to an an adda in a cafe um, or in a NGO or a workshops that I do in Sambhavna Institute every year, or at a school, kind of free period of our middle or high school class, or anywhere else. So I'm constantly thinking of if there's a space that someone will invite me to, where I can speak about something that's close to my heart to a bunch of different people and see where they want to take those ideas, I'm game. And if that takes the form of filmmaking or writing or podcast or physical presence in the form of a lecture or whatever, um, uh, I don't think there's anything about um, the high and mightiness of the scholar that applies, um, to me at least. It doesn't apply. So I don't care for that kind of scholarly gravitas. So I'll engage with any of these spaces, and I enjoy very much. And I think the cautionary statement I'll end with is that scholars will have no choice but to do these things in the years to come, in the decades to come.
Thank you so much for that great kind of tour from time and capital to public scholarship and public humanities. I'll stop recording here.